There's a simple saying that goes, every shore remembers. And down at Barry Island there is one bay called Jackson's Bay that's actually full of old stories. Like saints who are lost to the sea, smugglers who ruled the cliff tops, and even ghostly lights that people still talk about seeing at night to this very day. So long before the lighthouse and the docks that you actually see today, this place was actually home to a monk called Baruc, and he was a follower of Saint Baruc, who was just a kind of humble guy living out here on the island. Now, the story goes that Saint Baruc actually asked Baruc to go back over to Flatholm Island, which they had just returned from, to fetch the sacred book that they'd left behind. Now, as Baruc set out to sea, there was this storm that came out of nowhere. Now, Baruc was only in a little boat, and his boat could not cope with the large waves, and eventually it capsized, and he was sadly lost to the sea. Now, for days the tide carried his body across the channel until eventually he was washed up on the shores of what we now call Jackson's Bay. He was then found by monks who decided to build a chapel to honour him on the cliff tops, and also to put up a stone shrine to mark where he'd actually come ashore. Now, people from all over Wales started visiting, and pilgrims actually believe that 4 trips to this particular chapel was the same as 1 pilgrimage to Rome. So at this particular time, it was a pretty big deal. But also near the chapel, there was a holy well, which locals said its waters had healing powers. They drop in pins and little tokens whilst making a wish, but the trick was you had to stay silent until a stranger spoke, or the wish wouldn't come true. But the story doesn't end there, as the miracle came. As one morning, fishermen were out in the bay when they caught this huge salmon. They opened it up on deck, and inside was the sacred book Baruc had lost to the sea. Now, the pages were completely dry and untouched, and people saw this as a sign that the sea had given back what it had once taken. And this is how the legend of Saint Baruc actually began. With foundations of the chapel, which still stands today, though being half covered in ivy, are still watching over the same waters that claimed him. Centuries later though, the island would attract a whole different kind of visitor: smugglers. By the late 1700s, Barry Island had become the perfect hideout for people living by the tides and the shadows. The most notorious of them was a guy called Thomas Knight, who showed up around 1783 with a heavily armed brig called the John O'Coombe. Now, he took one look at Jackson's Bay with the high cliffs and the hidden cove, and he realised what a perfect base this could be. And so he went about setting up and fortifying the area, and he even built up a small little fleet. Now, his men brought in rum, tea, tobacco and other types of contraband, straight from the Channel Islands and Ireland, right under the noses of custom officers. And at one point, Knight had around 60 or 70 men and basically turned Barry Island into his own mini fortress. Locals often sided with him as well, as most of them benefited from the trade, but they also respected him a lot more than the distant rule of King George III. Now, it's actually during these times there were plenty of reports of gunfire echoing across the cliff tops, the use of lanterns flashing through the fog to signal incoming ships, and custom officers who got too close to catching the smugglers disappearing for good. Now, for a good while, this place was ruled by the smugglers. But then in 1887, Knight was finally forced out and had to retreat to Lundy Island. But this wasn't before his ship was actually confiscated. But the smuggling didn't just end there. Others, like William Arthur, carried on the trade, using the same secret coves, cliff paths, to bring goods ashore in the dark. Though decades later, after it all came to an end, locals swore they could still see the flickering lights along the cliffs. Some said they were the ghostly smuggler lanterns, whilst others claimed they were the spirits of drowned sailors, still guarding the treasures that they never actually got to spend. But then fast forward to the 1880s, Barry Island was going to change once again, and Jackson's Bay would be transformed forever. As the coal industry in South Wales was booming, and they needed a proper port to handle it all. That's when Sir John Jackson, a big-name civil engineer, was brought in to transform the area. Now, his plan was huge. He ended up building 3 massive dams to enclose the harbour, with the western dam especially tough because it sat on deep, soft mud. But the engineers came up with clever solutions, with timber viaducts to actually move the stone and soil, and pumps to drain the water so the work could actually continue. Once it was actually enclosed, they used steam-powered machines and even dynamite to clear the harbour basin. Now, they reused all the removed material to actually build the embankments and the roads. But then in 1889, Jackson's massive breakwater and harbour was complete, with Barry becoming one of the main coal exporting ports in the country. Now, the breakwater actually still stands today, a monument to that era of industry. Now at its end there's a little lighthouse which is 11 metres tall, which is made completely of cast iron, which was actually built in 1889 by the Chance brothers at Birmingham. Back then it guided coal ships through the fog and the storms. There was even a small railway track that used to run across the breakwater to actually haul materials up to it. Now the railway tracks are actually gone now, but the lighthouse does still remain, and this is a testament to the era of the coal industry that was happening at that particular time. Now these days Jackson's Bay is a calm, sheltered little cove with a blue flag beach. Up on the cliff, Saint Baruc's old chapel and sacred well still rest there, though certainly weathered by time. Showing Jackson's Bay isn't just a beach, it's a place rich in history, from monks to pilgrims to smugglers, through helping provide the world with the coal that it so much needed.